Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Jerusalem Fund and our educational program, the Palestine Center. Welcome also to our online viewers. My name is Zaina Azam, and I'm the Executive Director here. We are so delighted to have Dr. Faedah Totah here with us from Virginia Commonwealth University. She's an Associate Professor of Political Science there. As you know, the title of her talk is The Plight of Palestinians in the Syrian Conflict. The Palestinians have been caught in the middle of the fighting among the various factions in Syria, with some fighting on the anti-regime side, but most of them preferring to remain neutral in what they consider a Syrian domestic affair. Dr. Totah's presentation will discuss this latest predicament of the Palestinian refugees in Syria, and she'll also examine how the conflict has once again highlighted the vulnerability of Palestinian refugees in civil wars throughout the Middle East. She will also look at the future of the Palestinian community in Syria. I've asked her to talk for about 40 minutes, after which we'll open the floor for discussion and questions. Those of you who are online can tweet your questions to us at Palestine Center. Let me introduce our speaker more fully. As I mentioned, Dr. Faedah Totah is an associate professor in the Political Science Department at VCU, Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, Virginia. She teaches courses on gender, development, and politics of the contemporary Middle East, including political Islam. She has a PhD in cultural anthropology from the University of Texas at Austin and an MA degree in Arab Studies from Georgetown University, where I met her when she was doing her MA some years ago. Over the past decade, and before the civil war in Syria, she explored the social and economic impact of gentrification on the old city of Damascus. The results of this research were the subject of the book titled Preserving the Old City of Damascus, published in 2014 by Syracuse University Press. Currently, she's working on a manuscript that examines the political role of Palestinian urban refugees in Damascus. Welcome, Faedah Totah.
Thank you, Zaina, for that wonderful introduction. And it's always a pleasure to be here at the Jerusalem Fund. As Zaina mentioned, I was a student at Georgetown where I first encountered the center. And so it's always great to come back in different ways, in different forms. And I want to thank Zaina for arranging this talk and Samira for taking care of all the logistics. Samira is great. She's a pleasure to work with. She's so efficient, and it makes it a pleasure to want to come here and talk. And finally, I would like to thank all of you for taking time from your busy schedules to come here this afternoon and hear me talk. The plight of Palestinians in the Syrian conflict, but let's go back in time. 1976, almost 40 years ago, but this time Tel Zatar in Lebanon, home to approximately 50,000 Palestinian refugees. Lebanese civil war is in full swing, and anywhere from 1,500 to 3,000 Palestinians were killed during the fight between Lebanese forces and PLO forces in the camp. 6 years later, also in Lebanon, Sabra and Shatila, also during the ongoing civil war, but this time after the Israeli invasion of Lebanon and when the PLO left the country. Phalangist forces with cover from the Israeli Defense Forces entered the camp and massacred another disputed number that could be as low as 400 or high as 3,000 dead. And now Yarmouk, but this time in Syria. Anti-regime forces and the regime battling it out in Yarmouk with dozens of casualties and 1,800 people still living in the camp under siege. So this is a partial history of how spaces that are designated as Palestinian during proxy and civil wars become vulnerable and deadly for those who live in them. Yarmouk being the latest Palestinian space to become the site of battles and sieges in the region. What we see from the example of Yarmouk is that the neutrality of Palestinians and Palestinian spaces in any civil or proxy war is always questioned, and their civilian status always undermined by the fact that they are refugees. The killing and starvation of women and children continues to highlight the vulnerability of Palestinians, especially Palestinian refugees living in camps outside of historical Palestine. Of course, this is not to say that within historical Palestine, camps are safe spaces. We still remember Israeli invasion of Gaza and the attacks on camps in Gaza. But it also highlights the ineffectiveness of Palestinian political leadership to protect or assist Palestinians who live in refugee camps. But what we also know from history is that the horrific images of dead bodies, starving bodies, crying children will soon be relegated to the archives as more distressing images from the Eastern Mediterranean or other parts of the world vie for international attention. The camps in Lebanon were strictly Palestinian, but Yarmouk, an unofficial camp in Syria, had a mixed population where Palestinians and Syrians lived side by side in a relatively well-to-do Damascus neighborhood. Before the war, it was estimated that 150,000 Palestinians lived there, as well as 650,000 Syrians. So it's important to emphasize that it wasn't exclusively Palestinian. Actually, it was overwhelmingly Syrian neighborhood. But during times of conflict, these distinctions are rendered meaningless. So today, I will talk about the plight of Palestinians in the Syrian conflict, as exemplified by the latest camp under siege. This will include a discussion of the place of Palestinians in Syrian society and how the horrific conflict affects Palestinians doubly. They are twice victimized, twice displaced, twice forgotten. Not that Palestinians have a monopoly on being victimized when looking around the world, but in a cruel twist of irony, their plight seems to be repeated for each generation and not even. And because of the celebrity status of the Palestinian cause, it is something that is never far from the headlines. Though the headlines seem to be the same, they have different dates, different massacres, different attacks, different sieges, and a different number of people dead. I will also mention the role of the Palestinian Authority and conclude with how the situation in Syria will only get worse for Palestinians until a fair and just solution is negotiated, and this will entail the role of Israel in having a fair and just negotiation. All right, so Palestinians in Syria, according to UNRWA, it estimates that there are around 500,000 Palestinians registered as refugees living in Syria. And I want to emphasize the word registered because this means they have official status within the country. There are also a number of Palestinians who are not registered, therefore they're not really in any official count. The registered Palestinians came mainly from 1948. However, there have been other wars in the region which led to more waves of Palestinians coming into Syria, whether it's from Jordan in 1970 as a result of Black September, the civil war and Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, from other Arab countries. So there's a number, and it could be as high as 1,000. This is where statistics are they're not available, of Palestinians who are not registered and therefore not included in the official count by UNRWA. Some people do not have papers. They lost their Jordanian passports if they were involved in Black September, which meant Syria did not grant them any form of official recognition. Palestinians in Syria are not a homogeneous group. They are not a monolith. Rather than claiming a distinct Palestinian national identity, there are a lot of differences. There are Palestinians who live in urban areas. There are Palestinians who live in camps. There in Syria, you have 9 official camps and 3 unofficial camps. You have Palestinians who are educated professionals, and you have those that are laborers or some of that are unemployed, and of course you have the registered and unregistered. The situation for registered refugees in Syria meant that they were granted residency almost short of full citizenship within Syria. So their rights included, but were not limited to, access to education, employment opportunities, ownership of property, though ownership was restricted, like in the number of houses they could own. They could reside anywhere in the country. They could not vote. But if you know Syria history and its political process, not voting is not a serious thing. In Syria, the Palestinians have, I think they still have, their own security agency, Mukhabarat, and it's known as the Palestinian Mukhabarat. It has its own hierarchy, and they deal exclusively with Palestinians within Syria. So Palestinians in Syria were relatively integrated within the country, within the society. They were not considered a political liability because they were 2% of the population at most, so there wasn't the number. So if you compare them to Jordan and Lebanon, Palestinians of Syria had it much better. It's only relatively. For instance, we all know in Lebanon, Palestinians were confined to the camps. The camps are semi-autonomous Palestinian spaces, which means who comes into the camp, who leaves the camp is carefully monitored. But also in Lebanon, you have a restriction on where Palestinians can work, and there are 70 occupations which Palestinians in Lebanon cannot hold for political reasons. In Lebanon, in Jordan, for instance, you have almost 70% of the population Palestinian, but they're Jordanian with distinction on their passports that they are of Palestinian origins. Now, although Palestinians in Syria were relatively well integrated in society, they were always treated with suspicion by the paternalistic state, and their loyalty to the regime always tested. This was especially the case under Hafiz al-Assad, who used Palestinians willingly, unwillingly, wittingly, unwittingly, for his own political gains within the region. What's also important to note about Hafiz al-Assad is that he had a personal hostility with Yasser Arafat, and so that did not help the Palestinians living within Syria, and it also led to the split of the PFLP-GC. It's kind of a mouthful, under Ahmed Jibril, who remains loyal to the Syrian regime. He's against Oslo, and he was also against Arafat, and I'm sure he's not also has his own issues with the Palestinian Authority. So Palestinians in Syria, their neutrality was not always a given. They had to demonstrate their loyalty and their support to the regime, and sometimes to demonstrate their opposition to the PLO and to Fatah especially. The war in Syria affected Palestinians as it did Syrians. You have displacement, you have internal displacement, you have people who left the country, you've had kidnapping, you have deaths. The UK-based group Action Group for Palestinians in Syria estimated 3,000 Palestinians have been killed since the beginning of the war in 2011. 303 killed in the first half of this year alone. It's estimated 250 have been kidnapped for ransom. And according to Jafra Foundation, in Yarmouk, at least 30 leaders have been assassinated. According to UNRWA sources, 280,000 Palestinians, almost half of the population in Syria, officially recognized, has been displaced internally. 80,000 left Syria. It's estimated that about 43,000 left for Lebanon and 16,000 left for Jordan. 95% of Palestinians in Syria are dependent on humanitarian aid from UNRWA. And so if you look at the experience of Yarmouk and the experience of Palestinians at the borders with Jordan and Lebanon, it exemplifies how Palestinians are doubly affected just because they are Palestinians during conflicts, where all forms of national solidarity are abrogated and where Palestinians are once again rendered vulnerable due to their political status that lacks a clearly defined nation-state affiliation. Syrians belong to Syria, Palestinians do not never did have a nation state that can claim them. And we see this with how it played out in Yarmouk, and I'm not going to go into much details about what happened in Yarmouk. We all know that there was the fighting between anti-regime forces and regime forces in Yarmouk. At first, you had the Free Syrian Army that entered the camp, which then allowed, well, it was kind of like a green light for the regime to drop barrel bombs on the camp, which led to the fleeing of most of the population. So you had 800,000 people, Palestinians and Syrians, living in the space that dwindled down to 18,000 people. And those people remained in the camp while the battles were raging between the regime and the anti-regime. Nusra managed to come into the camp, and then it kind of paved the way for Daesh, or ISIS as it's known in the West, and the fight continued. The 18,000 people that remained during these battles include 3,000 children, anywhere between 1,000 and 4,000 Syrians. Therefore, today, Yarmouk has reverted to becoming largely a Palestinian space. Where did the people go? Well, some of them are displaced internally. A lot of what Palestinians always seem to rely on is the social networks they have with family and kin throughout the region, in Lebanon, in Syria, and even in Jordan. So many of them left and moved in with relatives, which led to crowded conditions. The camp since 2013 was under siege, and that led to a lot of hardships. Typhoid broke out in the camp among people who remained there. There was the issue of starvation because humanitarian aid was not allowed into the camp. There was a lack of cooking or heating fuel. Electricity, so the Palestinians and the Syrians who remained in the camp were freezing in the winter and sweltering in the heat of the summer. There have been attempts to end the siege and appeals to allow humanitarian aid. Some of them have been partially heeded. Interestingly enough, last July, the UN declared Yarmouk as no longer a besieged area in Syria. The UN defines a besieged area as one that is surrounded by armed actors with the sustained effects that humanitarian assistance cannot regularly enter and civilians, the sick and wounded, cannot regularly exit the area. Nidal Batari, who I believe was one of your speakers, noted on the Middle East Institute website last September that based on this definition, the camp is still under siege. Civilians inside the camp aren't able to move in or out with any regularity, with multiple armed factions controlling checkpoints in the area. Since April 2015, no emergency medical case has received permission to be evacuated. Only a small number of students were allowed to exit the camp to sit for school exams in Damascus. In this exceptional case, those leaving required permission from parties to the conflict on both sides of the checkpoint. For anybody who's traveled in the Middle East and had to cross checkpoints, it's a challenge under normal circumstances, so you can only imagine what it's like for these Palestinians trying to leave Yarmouk with all these different factions having their own checkpoints. And they're not talking to one another either. So Palestinians are also being used by their own leaders and others for their political posturing. And I think that is the real human tragedy, where they are pawns in political leaders' games. Israel claims that it will allow Palestinians from Syria into areas controlled by the Palestinian Authority, but only if they forego the right of return, which was, of course, rejected by the Palestinian Authority. And Ramzi Baroud, who wrote in the Arab News in April 2015, says, Israel knows that the memory of the refugees is its greatest enemy. So when the Palestinian leadership requested that Israel allow Yarmouk refugees to move to the West Bank, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had a condition that they renounce their right of return. Palestinians refused. History has shown that Palestinians would endure untold suffering and not abandon their rights in Palestine. The fact that Netanyahu would place such a condition is not just a testimony to Israel's fear of Palestinian memory, but the political opportunism and sheer ruthlessness of the Israeli government. The Palestinian Authority was established in 1994 based on a clear charter where a small group of Palestinians returned to the occupied territories, set up a few institutions, and siphoned billions of dollars in international aid in exchange for abandoning the right of return for Palestinian refugees and ceding any claim on real Palestinian sovereignty and nationhood. So when it comes to what's happening in Syria, the Palestinians are pretty much left on their own. There have been appeals that the Palestinians should not be involved in the fight against Daesh or the regime. There are some Palestinians who did not listen to that call. But again, Palestinians are not allowed to remain neutral in any conflict. So that's Palestinians in Syria. Let's look at what happened to Palestinians who tried to leave the country, the 80,000 Palestinians who left the country. They either went to Jordan, Lebanon, and some to Turkey and beyond. Leaving the country itself is fraught with hardships because people are Palestinian. It's easier if you are Syrian, but you have many mixed families who are both Syrian and Palestinian. So you would have one part of the family leave and the other part would have to remain behind. And Palestinians need permission from the Syrian government to leave and permission from neighboring countries to enter. Permission entails amount of money to be exchanged, a deposit, or paying for visas, and of course there's the issue of bribes. So there's a lot of corruption in this process just to leave. If we look at Jordan and Lebanon, Syrians at the beginning of the conflict were granted a 6-month residency permit. Palestinians were only given 1 week, and then they had to renew it every month, which required money. In Jordan, there was the case where it was returning a lot of Palestinians back. Those without valid visas or papers and were not sent back were taken to a special camp called Cyber City. And it's this walled industrial complex town near Ramtha in the desert, and housed in apartments that were built for foreign workers who were working in this industrial complex. It included some Palestinians who had Jordanian citizenship withdrawn from them for political reasons. They probably had a role in Black September or were anti-King. There is fear in Jordan of another wave of Palestinians coming in because it seems almost every war in the region sends a wave of Palestinians to Jordan. Human Rights Watch issued a report in 2012 on the bias on the Syrian border, describing the arbitrary practice by Jordanian authorities in dealing with Palestinians fleeing the war in Syria. Some were deported, some were detained, and although many Palestinians from Syria had relatives in Jordan, the policy to release asylum seekers to relatives was stopped for Palestinians. So there was a splitting of families, who was sent back, who was allowed to continue on further into Jordan. But Jordan, as a sovereign nation, can determine what constitutes national security threat and act accordingly. Jordan has not ratified hasn't signed nor ratified the 1951 Refugee Convention. And in that convention, it prohibits countries from sending anyone back to a country where their life or freedom would be threatened, or where they would face a real risk of torture or inhumane and degrading treatment or punishment. When Jordan is called on this, they would insist that they're acting within its national security interest and they're exercising sovereignty. Jordan eventually closed the borders for refugees from Syria. Lebanon. Refugees going to Lebanon, another story. Half the refugees entered in 2013, but by August of that year, restrictions were put into place. And then by 2014, the border also closed, at least for legal refugees. The border with Lebanon is pretty porous. A vulnerability assessment conducted by UNRWA and AUB showed that 33% of Palestinian refugees from Syria went to Sidon in the south, followed by Beirut. Some lived in camps, some lived outside of camps. And those who entered Lebanon legally have let their visas expire. And part of the reason is that they could not afford the $200 fee to renew the permit. There's no work because there's restrictions on employment in Lebanon. They're living on donations and UNRWA assistance. There's this huge toll on health and hygiene. Rent is expensive in Beirut. There were cases where people were renting out garages for $400. There's an increase in unregistered births, an increase in school dropouts. So for Palestinian refugees from Syria, it is estimated that 80% have exhausted their savings, 90% have been forced to sell assets, 60% are living in crowded and poor conditions, and 93% have limited work opportunities. So UNRWA concludes that the tensions will rise between Palestinian refugees from Syria and Palestinians who are already living in Lebanon and who don't really have it easy. But there's also friction between the Lebanese population, especially from Lebanese politicians who have used the Palestinians as scapegoats for the problems facing Lebanon for decades now. Memories of the civil war and the role of the PLO, and by extension Palestinians, continue to resurface. But once again, spaces designated as Palestinian have become the target of local warring factions. Ain al-Hilwa, near the city of Sidon in the south, is hosting more than 10,000 Palestinians from Syria, has become a site of contention. In June of 2013, a Salafi cleric called on all Sunni Muslims, including Palestinians in Lebanon, to fight against the Lebanese army and Hezbollah. Following the call, members of Fatah al-Islam and other militant groups, such as Jund al-Sham, fired on a Lebanese military checkpoint near Ain al-Hilwa. And then last August, there was more fighting between Islamist groups, and this time Fatah in Ain al-Hilwa, that led to 6 being killed, 70 injured, and 3,000 displaced. So this theme of displacement seems to be a recurring one. Like, how many times can you be displaced in a lifetime? Palestinian factions inside and outside the camp were determined not to take part in attacks against the Lebanese military. But of course, neutrality is never an option and never holds. Mo Ali Niyal noted in an article for the Electronic Intifada that the Phalangist, or the Kata'ib Party, site claims that Jabhat al-Nusra, a group linked to Al-Qaeda, is active in Ain al-Hilwa. The article claims, citing anonymous sources, that there is an intention by a fundamentalist group in the camp to create a branch for Jabhat al-Nusra in order to destabilize security in the camp and its surroundings. So there is this incitement by Lebanese politicians against Palestinian refugees, especially those coming from Syria. But in this article, Niyal also goes on to note that despite his party's antipathy towards Palestinian, Mahmoud Abbas, during a trip to Lebanon in July 2013, found time to meet with the Kata'ib leader, Amin al-Jumayl. And he goes on to say that apart from telling Palestinians not to take part in the violence, Abbas has shown little regard for the concern of his people in Lebanon. He did not visit any of the camps. He was rather criticized for staying at the Phoenicia Intercontinental Hotel in Beirut. And he did have time to meet with the Lebanese pop singer Raghib Alami and present him with a Palestinian passport and honorary citizenship, while Palestinians in Lebanon, Syrian and Palestinians in Lebanon, were just languishing in the camps a few miles away. So once again, being let down by the Palestinian Authority is a common theme. There have also been protests against UNRWA because UNRWA keeps announcing it will suspend its emergency and humanitarian aid because of fund shortfalls, and which means Palestinians are going to be placed under more hardship. Lebanese Palestinians from Syria and Lebanon, especially those without papers, are arrested and detained if they're caught by the Lebanese forces. It's leading many of the Palestinians to take to the sea in rickety boats to cross the Mediterranean and try to go to Europe. So, the future of Palestinians. You can't really rely on the PLO or the Palestinian Authority. This is a cartoon by Nidal al-Khairi. Some of you know Nationality, who really was very precise and harsh of his criticism of Palestinian leadership, and it looks like Nidal al-Khairi is kind of carrying that banner of Palestinians criticizing their own leadership. So it just shows how ineffective the Palestinian Authority is in the region. But most importantly, what now? And I think this image really summarizes the plight of Palestinians, period, not only Palestinians from Syria, where to go from here. So to conclude, the plight of Palestinians in Syria is not separate from what's happening to Syrians, but Palestinians do magnify the human tragedy in Syria because of their political vulnerability and lack of political leadership. UNRWA has been calling for donors to increase their support to the Syrian crisis. They claim that they only received 34% of funds that were needed for 2015. And they estimated, as I mentioned earlier, that 95% of Palestinians in Syria now rely on UNRWA to meet their daily needs of food, water, and health care. Palestinians are vulnerable because they are stateless. Conflicts in the Middle East directly affect Palestinians. The Gulf War in 1991 led to 500,000 Palestinians being expelled from Kuwait, many of them ended up in Jordan. The U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 led to the expulsion of 10 to 30,000 Palestinians who were seen as allied with Saddam. Many of them nobody wanted. Syria didn't want to take them in. Jordan did not want to take them in, so they languished in no man's land for a while in makeshift camps until third-party countries took them in. I think many of them ended up going to Brazil and other countries in Latin America. In 2011, Libya expelled its Palestinian population, who were also trapped on the border with Egypt that did not want to take them in, and they also languished in no man's land. So what will the future of Palestinians in Syria be? If Assad is removed from power and Syria is divided into the different warring factions, or what is known as the Balkanization of Syria, chances are Palestinians will be expelled, as happened in Kuwait, in Iraq, in Libya, etc., for their perceived complicity with the regime. If Assad remains in power while a transition process is underway, Palestinians will still be treated with suspicion and their loyalty will be constantly tested, like what happened in Jordan after Black September. What is likely to happen is that more Palestinians will continue to leave. And unlike Syrians who seek to leave, returning will not be an option. We're already seeing many Palestinians seeking asylum in Europe. And many have family members there. I think that's one thing that we have to remember, that Palestinians are such a diasporic community that they have these social networks. So there could be family unification in European or even countries beyond here in the United States, Canada, Australia. And Palestinians will find new homes outside the region. But they will come, it's another form of displacement, like how far removed can you be from Palestine. But there are also this group of Palestinians who are considered dangerous and who are marked by security agencies in different countries around the world that they are undesirable, either because of their affiliation with Hamas or either because of their affiliation with the PFLP-GC. So there's going to be a group that are not going to be welcomed anywhere. Of course, there will be Palestinians who will remain in the region, and their situation is not going to be great by any stretch of the imagination. Lebanon, I don't see things changing for Palestinians in Lebanon. Lebanon is going to remain tricky. And Jordan doesn't want any more Palestinians. We're dealing with two countries that are not domestically stable, who have their own political problems. And Palestinians are just going to add to that mix, and Palestinians are going to be easy scapegoats for political problems that these countries face. What we know for sure is the Palestinian Authority, as the PLO before it, are unable to do anything to help. They have no political leverage. They're too corrupt, and also pretty much separated split the Palestinians between those that are now more or less secured within the territories, West Bank being much better than Gaza, and those who are outside. And there seems to be no attempt to bridge the two groups, outside and inside. And so there needs to be a final solution, a just and fair solution, I don't even know why I'm talking about this, that includes a right of return, which is not likely to happen anytime soon with the current Israeli government and the conditions that are now taking place in both Gaza and the West Bank. But this also means that with no change in sight, we probably, unfortunately, will see a repeat of massacres, of sieges, of more hardship for Palestinians in Syria and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Totah, for this sobering assessment. It's time now to take your questions, and if anybody would like to ask a question, please wait until the microphone comes to you so everybody can, yes, would you like Saeed?
Thank you. My name is Saeed Erekat. I'm a Palestinian journalist. I wanted to ask you about the other camps in Syria, like in Homs and the other area. That's one. Second, do you have a figure on the number of Palestinians that actually made it to Europe? Thank you.
Well, thank you for your question. And as for the first question about the other camps, they are also under siege, because like Yarmouk is not the only camp around Damascus. There are other smaller camps that have also witnessed a displacement of population, like what's happening with the rest of the Syrian population. As far as I know, there are some camps in the northern part of the country, like Nera, which is outside of Aleppo, which seems for the most part to have escaped. But that doesn't mean that people are not suffering under hardship, because there are no jobs and there are no opportunity, and they're running out of savings. So some camps are relatively okay, but other camps are under siege, or people are just leaving. The other thing, your other question, I was looking for that number, and it seems to have been not teased out of the number of Syrians who are making it to Europe. So I don't really have a figure on the number of who made it to Europe.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. I've never heard the term Palestinian space, so
Okay.
thank you for that. What is
my term?
It's a nice term. It's a good term. What is the importance of Yarmouk with a dwindling population? Why is it so important in Syria, and why is there so much horror? And then the second question, in the camps in Lebanon, nationalism is a priority. It's 24/7. It's social, it's cultural, it's educational, maps of Palestine, etc. I'm wondering, was that the same in Syria over the past years? Thank you.
Yarmouk is important because it was a mixed space and it was an unofficial camp, which meant Syrians could also live there. And as I mentioned in my talk, it was overwhelmingly Syrian. So it was a neighborhood of Damascus. It was a huge neighborhood. And if you go to Yarmouk, you don't even see it as a camp. You know, there's Faedah Palestinians, and then you walk up and down the streets, wonderful streets. You had apartment buildings, you had stores, you had shops. You know, some of them would have like Jalil or Julan, or like some kind of indication that the people who owned the store came from northern Palestine, which was where most of the Palestinians who ended up in Syria came from. So it was a thriving neighborhood where you don't get a sense of it is a camp. And it also demonstrated that Palestinians could live in a host society and thrive and be integrated until they no longer were. Okay, so that's the important of Yarmouk, but it's also strategically important because of where it's geographically located, and it serves as the entrance to the southern part of Damascus, and it's also close to the Shia neighborhood. It's on the way to Sayyida Zainab, which is a shrine, but also a thriving Shia neighborhood in suburbs of Damascus, where you have Shia from all over the world who live there. So it becomes like hitting the regime at its heart, because not only is that where you have Palestinians who are supposed to be allied with the regime, but that's also where you have a strong Shia presence, and the Shia are aligned with the regime. And as for nationalism in Syrian camps, this goes back to how Syrians control the politics of Palestinians within the country. And so Palestinian nationalism was muted, and it was controlled by how they could express it. So they would allow demonstrations against Israeli atrocities, but you couldn't demonstrate in support of the PLO or something like that. I remember going to Yarmouk camp, and this was towards the end of 2004, when Arafat died, right? And there were this huge demonstration in Yarmouk, and I was like, whoa, this is interesting. And it was interesting because that's when the two factions, the Fatah and Hamas, who were in the Yarmouk, actually were united in their demonstration. But the mukhabarat, the Syrian mukhabarat, were everywhere, because the next couple of days, and I was living in the old city of Damascus at the time, one of my friends from the neighborhood said, they're asking about you. I was like, what do you mean? The mukhabarat came to ask about me because I was in the camp during a demonstration. So they were allowed certain forms of expression that made the regime look bad, but they couldn't express like they did in the, as you mentioned, in the camps of Lebanon. And one more thing that I want to add, you probably all remember the incident in June of 2011 when the Syrian regime bused Palestinians from Yarmouk camp and other parts of Damascus to the border with Israel and occupied Julan in the Golan Heights, to demonstrate against the Nakba. Okay, it was like the my math is bad, but it was the anniversary of the Nakba, and that's when Palestinians supposedly charged over the fence, and then there was shooting. That never happened before. Syria has kept that border with Israel quiet. Israel didn't even have to worry about any incidences happening on its border with Syria. So it just shows how Syria was manipulating the war that was going on internally and the Palestinians' role by taking them to demonstrate. And actually, it was these demonstrations that led to the killing of Palestinians and their funerals in Yarmouk that led to the fighting in Yarmouk to happen.
Thank you for your presentation. You've obviously been to a number of these camps. I wondered if you could share with us maybe some stories of encouragement about leadership that you've met or women that you've met in some of these camps who look like they're going to have a more and more important role in the future.
Well, I should say upright that I never went to the camps in Lebanon. I've been to Lebanon several times, but I didn't go to the camps. But I've been to Yarmouk several times, and my research really focused on Palestinian refugees in the old city of Damascus because I was interested in Palestinian spaces that were not designated as camps. And what's fascinating about that, and this is part of my future research that I be working on, writing, I should say writing, because the research part has been done, is that you find this disappointment with the official leadership, okay? So none of the Palestinians in Syria are pinning any hopes on Mahmoud Abbas or the Palestinian Authority. They already know they've been abandoned. Oslo has been a disappointment. Nothing has changed in 20 years. It's been 20 years, oh my God. 22 years, oh God. I'm sorry, I'm just like, I was in Ramallah when Oslo was signed, and there was just such euphoria, and people were in the streets partying and celebrating, and I'm thinking, wow. And so anyway, and many Palestinians who were involved in politics and who were heavily involved in recruiting and organizing for the cause, the Palestinian cause, were just disappointed, disillusioned, and many of them just picked up and left. However, you do have this grassroots movement, and one thing that interested me was this women's center, not even in Yarmouk camp, but in the old city of Damascus, where local people were just coming together, seeing what the needs were for Palestinians, and working with UNRWA to provide them. So, and I don't want to be proud, but Palestinians are very resourceful, and they're very resilient, and they know how to adapt. So I'm sure they're going to find ways to make this work. They're going to come together, they're going to pool their resources, they know how to organize, and Nidal is part of their life, whether it's political Nidal or just social Nidal. But they're not going to be leaders that we're going to hear about, and they're not going to be leaders who are going to be promoted to speak on behalf of Palestinian. That's pretty much been held by, I don't know, like these leaders who've been in these positions for a long time. I think the Palestinians need their own Arab Spring to get rid of, can I say that? To get rid of some of their leaders who've been in power for 30 years or so.
Any other questions? Yes, still in there in the back. In the back.
So Obama has promised to take 10,000 Syrians at least to the U.S. It seems, but are the Palestinian Syrian refugees part of that equation? It seems like Homeland Security could do so fast background checks since UNRWA has been taking care of them for ages. Is that something we can push for here in this country?
You could, but I think when Obama says they're going to take 10,000, it's not like you're going to say, count what 10,000 they're going to come in. They're going to be highly selected, right? And of course, 10,000 with the amount, the tragedy that's going on, that's kind of like very small percentage. It's kind of like Cameron saying we're going to be taking 5,000 for the next 4 years, 20,000. I think Palestinians are going to be a problem because just being Palestinians and just being refugees marks these people as problematic, right? So you don't want them to come in because you don't know what they're going to do. And that's the reason why Jordan doesn't want them, and that's why the reason that Lebanon doesn't want them. Of course, there are a lot of Palestinians who live here, and you can get them in through family reunification. But what is really important to remember is because Palestinians are stateless, that makes them suspect regardless of what country they go to. Like they're going to Europe, but they're still being scrutinized as Palestinians. Like, which groups do they belong to? And then let's not forget that Hamas had its headquarters. Well, like Khaled Mishal was in Damascus for a while, and there was a number of Hamas leadership from Gaza who made it to Syria. And so those people are undesirable because Hamas is declared a terrorist organization, and you don't want anybody remotely affiliated with them. So deciding who comes in and who doesn't, it's very, very tricky, and I would say Palestinians are not going to have an easy transit anywhere. and counting.
Can you wait till the microphone? Thank you so much. How difficult is it to get into Damascus now? And when was the last time you were there? And
I was there back in 2008, and I haven't tried to go back since. And I don't think they will let me in because I have an American passport. And though I'm born in this country, which means there's nothing on my passport to indicate that I'm Palestinian, but I'm flagged as Palestinian because I don't look American enough. So, and that's been an issue for me in Syria. It's very fascinating. It's like, I'm not Palestinian. It's like, yes, you are, because you don't look American. And it's your official documents are not official because of the way you look and the way your name sounds and looks like. So I didn't try to go back in, but apparently they do allow people back in. The road between Beirut and Damascus seems to be the easiest way to get in legally, unless you want to be smuggled through Turkey, which that's not my thing. And so there was no reason for me to even try to go back.
I'll just mention I was up at the UN last week and was speaking with some people that have NGO work in Syria. And they were bringing some of the people that work in Syria, I mean Syrians who are working, they wanted them to come out to Beirut. And they said on the day that they came out in various taxis, it only took 2 hours to get from Damascus into Beirut, going through the checkpoints, which is, I guess, not, I don't know if that's normal or not, but I was stunned that still there's traffic back and forth.
That's normal before the war, but that could be one, because it could take longer depending on what's happening. And yeah.
I have a friend, her father is Palestinian and her mother is Syrian, so because, no, yeah. I think that's what it is, yeah. And so I've noticed that...
Her father's Syrian?
Palestinian,
okay,
has Palestinian, and then so...
Okay, you're better off if your father's Syrian.
Right. So my follow-up question, I just wanted to make sure I so my follow-up question is how gender and citizenship, nationality plays a role, and how does that affect migration patterns in regards to, do you see a lot of women being left behind, or a lot of, I don't know, I'm trying to figure out, so how, are there any trends that might affect the demographics of camps? And
well, first of all, you said something very interesting, like if father Syrian, father Palestinian, and that because patriarchal society, and that means citizenship is also patriarchal. So only it's passed through the father's line. So in Syria, the mother cannot pass her national identity to her children. It's only passed through the father. So if you're a Syrian woman and you married a Palestinian, your children are going to be considered Palestinian, and they're not going to have any Syrian citizenship. But if you're a Syrian man who married a Palestinian, then your children are going to be considered Syrian, and that kind of gives you more protection than having a father that is Palestinian. And I kind of mentioned about how the border splits families, and that's how the split was happening. So you do have families leaving, but most of the men who were crossing over most of the people who were crossing over into Europe were men, but now you're having more women crossing. So before, you could say it was predominantly male, but now women are leaving as well, because the situation is just getting worse.
Any other questions? Yes, go ahead.
My name is Aida Maqdisi Armali, and I'm Lebanese American. And you say that you were in Lebanon more than once, but you didn't want to go to the refugee camps, the Palestinian refugee camps. And I'm wondering why, although Lebanon had the greatest number of Palestinians in the whole Arab countries. Why is that you didn't want to go?
Well, it's more of a personal reason, because I don't want to go to the camps for tourism, right? And I didn't have a very good example to go there, and I was just against going to tourism, just to the camps, just to check them out. So that's why I didn't go. And the camps in Lebanon are restricted areas, and they do check people who come in and out, and without any reason to go in, I couldn't justify it. The camps are not parks or just to zoom through.
Dr. Totah, I actually have a couple of questions myself.
Okay.
One, a very small one. When we had the speaker from the Jafra Foundation, which does a lot of humanitarian work in Yarmouk, he said that the UN is actually not able to get in their UNRWA very well, and in fact, he said that some people are dying of malnutrition and hunger. I wondered if you had any ideas about what's going on now, whether this is still the situation, and how much UNRWA has access to the camps.
UNRWA's and access to the camps is restricted because of the situation, and they've had some of their workers either attacked or kidnapped, and so he's absolutely right in that UNRWA is not able to function in the camps. UNRWA was trying to distribute food packages, and then what happened, I think I mentioned this, like they would be stolen or they would be taken by non-Palestinians, by the fighting factions, because it's a business and you can sell them on the black market. And that's why UNRWA switched to financial aid. Like they give cash assistance to these people because they don't want to have to deal with the logistics of getting in. You have to get permission from all of these different groups, and that permission may not even come when they ask for it. And so they just decided to distribute cash assistance, but also UNRWA is running down. I think they don't have the funds to even support Palestinian in the area. And I know UNRWA is kind of like political and it's very, very charged, but at the end of the day, it's what they have. It's the only thing left there that's even keeping the tragedy of what's happening to Palestinians in Syria alive, though they kind of like really use it to solicit funds. And if you look at the images of their brochures, it's always children and women and with destruction, but that's what they need to do in order to raise the funds.
My second question is about your forthcoming book. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about this concept of urban refugees and why you'd like to focus on that in Damascus.
Well, thank you, because as you mentioned in the introduction, my training is a cultural anthropologist, and so the whole idea is that we work in the current, right? What's now and then, and we talk. Unfortunately, because of the situation in Syria, my first book and my coming book have turned into kind of a history books because they deal with a situation in Syria that is no longer. But I feel it needs to be commemorated and needs to be remembered because there were optimistic times and there was a lot of hope. And so my interest was there's been a lot of work on Palestinians in camps, whether in Jordan, whether in Lebanon, and also within Syria. Everybody seemed to be working on Palestinians in camps, which is important and needs to be done, but my interest was in urban spaces, in urban areas. So when I found a group of Palestinians who were living in the old city in a particular neighborhood, Shagur, and they were treating it like a camp, I became very intrigued, and I wanted to focus on it as a non-camp camp in a historic city that was quickly gentrifying, so the presence of Palestinian was not desirable, and actually being refugees tainted the history and the culture and what they were trying to do with the old city and how Palestinians were navigating this. Gentrification, living in Syria as Palestinians, and still maintaining a semblance of community and national identity.
Well, if there are no more questions, I think we'll conclude this session. Thank you so much, Dr. Faedah Totah, for this very enlightening and complex talk. We learned a lot. So thank you very much, and I'm sure she'll stay for a few minutes if people want to talk to her individually. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.